seeing how the different ages react to the different games that we play gives me a lot of insight into their thought processes. One of the teens has a lot of patience and will go to a lot of effort to troubleshoot things if a game is really buggy. The other one is the one that just goes, well, screw this, I'm out of here, there's lots of other games to play, and won't even try. So that tells you a lot about how people are reacting to games. And these are the same kids that are going to be making games for the rest of us in the future.
What do people fundamentally misunderstand about the community management role? Evan, I'll come to you first.
Community management has really expanded significantly in the last 2 decades. Really, we've seen it go from a sort of a collection of skills that were seen as very granular or very, kind of boots on the ground, to now being part of, not just part of, but actually a keystone of most marketing campaigns. Basically, what we've seen community management really evolve into is essentially PR for players. In a lot of ways is a common way to describe it. It's finding ways to basically engage with folks in such a way where we are listening to where they are collecting, we're harvesting their information in an actionable way where players can essentially speak where they collect, we harvest it, we bring it back to our team and facilitate two-way communication. This is essentially how we make sure that our dev teams are aware of what folks are saying, the velocity of it, the severity of it, the impact of it, to take that information and identify how we're going to respond to it, how we're going to change things in the game, how we're going to make players aware of what is coming. And then we do that in reverse as well. We take the information from our dev teams who sometimes don't, understand the best ways to communicate with players. They sometimes will, think in more inside baseball terms. They'll use, glossary that is a little bit above the ken of the average player. And what the community manager does is basically make sure that that communication hits both in terms of how it's said and where it's said in a cadence that works for players. So essentially it's community management sometimes can be seen as, again, that sort of, oh, you're just responding to folks we're essentially facilitating two-way communication in a way that works internally and externally as well. That's, I think, the best thesis I can provide you for how we get misconstrued sometimes and what we actually do day to day.
I really like that idea of two-way communication. Stephen, do you have any thoughts on kind of like if that fits to your definition of community management or?
Yeah, I mean, Evan said it pretty damn well, to be honest. I would say that one of the biggest misconceptions I've seen over time, which seems almost absurd when you kind of step back, but you'd be surprised how many players think for some reason we are involved in changing the game or making decisions that they may or may not agree with, which is almost always not the case, unless possibly you've filtered up something from the community that's taken effect that people end up not liking, but that's pretty rare. But yeah, a lot of the time, there is this sort of belief that somehow we have made these decisions, and that often comes into not just game-related stuff, but sometimes it's, company or business decisions that are certainly not yours to make, but sometimes you're the messenger of that stuff. So, but I mean, that kind of goes with the territory, is like being the kind of the whipping boy or the target dummy or whatever you want to say, not to gender it, but, often you are that person in the front line. So, that's definitely a common misconception. And in terms of what we do, I think Evan, absolutely nailed it. PR for players is an interesting way to look at it. Although I wondered for a second whether he meant, well, you can obviously clarify, but whether it's kind of like PR on behalf of the players or PR to the players, because there's kind of both, really. Like sometimes you are obviously giving players a message that they may or may not be happy to hear, and other times you're giving the development studio a message from the players that they may or may not be happy to hear about, because often, understandably, dev studios think that they know best because they're making the game, they're very, very close to the game, they understand the game systems, they understand where they want to take the game, but sometimes that's not what players want, right? And I personally believe that the stronger and better studios are the ones that react to what players want, while obviously also taking into account what they think is going to be successful. The best example of that, I think, possibly of all time, is probably Fortnite, right? Which was not supposed to be a battle royale game, and they launched that with that kind of sort of survive the night ethos, build traps, hold off zombies, and all that kind of thing, and then they built the Battle Royale mode. I think it was in response to PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds. And then obviously it took off enormously. Right now, any company that saw massive success like that would not sit on their hands and just be like, nah, we should stay with our original plan. But at the same time, it took off because community was super excited about it. So that's a great example of where the community guided it to something enormous, and arguably industry changing. So yeah, there's a lot that can be done if you follow the community's wants, really.
And Linda, thoughts from you?
Well, I find a lot to agree with in both cases. The long and the short of it is, there's a lot of people who think that community management handles social media. Sure, we do some of that sometimes. A lot of people think that community management is part of customer support, and that is also true sometimes, or part of marketing and PR. That is also true sometimes. What I will say is that community management, the role you fulfill varies depending on the size of the team you're working with, the style of the game studio that you're working with, and a lot of other factors. One thing I used to always tell my community managers when they're first hired is, here's your job description. It's going to change. Like, it might change next week. It might change in 3 months' time. Expect change, because if nothing else, we're all about adaptability and understanding what we need to support the dev team, marketing, customer service, and most importantly of all, the players themselves.
So it's like this jack of all trades skill. Like, you need loads of soft skills. If you think about it, like a developer is like obviously developing code, like writing it straight into the game. Working with designers are often doing both. An artist will be creating art, and those are all like technical abilities. But when it comes to community management, you're looking at those soft skills, like the ability to interpret what players are thinking, to be able to make a decision based on kind of rules that you have set for the game, for kind of the terms of service. Like, you got to balance things, and it's not always clear. Linda, just because you ended really well there, how do you interpret like this idea of needing soft skills for CMs, and how do you judge them on it? Like, it's not as easy as hiring a developer because they're great at kind of coding. Like, what makes a great CM, and what are the soft skills there?
Sure, there is a tendency in some quarters to categorize soft skills and jack of all trades as a negative, as if anybody could do it. In fact, it's the opposite is true. You have to be infinitely adaptable and extremely well educated in order to switch from task to task and to adapt to the changing needs of your community and your company. So soft skills, absolutely. You have to have the ability to be a diplomat. You have to be able to do information gathering. Something that I struggle with is data analytics. See, I can't even pronounce it. And yet I've had to learn it because that's part of my job. You're facilitating all the time and definitely communicating. A lot of our communications is done with the written word, and as you know, it can be extraordinarily difficult to read tone and inflection into the written word. So you have to find ways of choosing words and punctuation and phrasing in order to make sure that your message is clear. So the soft skills, they ain't soft. Them is hard.
Evan, do you want to comment on that, or?
I think having actually worked for Linda for a time, I actually recall all too well the scaling, the shifting that happens with a community manager JD. There are duties which you would expect to be covering: communications, feedback harvesting, content production, etc. There are duties that are completely ad hoc and things that are still within your purview and things that you'll need to build into, whether it's event coordination, influencer management, data science. There's a ton of sort of tangential disciplines that the community manager often will adopt, first to support the duties that they're doing, and then sometimes actually to build into a role of their own. My own experience was, come to think of it, was actually originally started off as community manager at Trion, and then started working on live stream production and influencer management as a dual role. So essentially, there are a lot of tangential paths within the discipline. Sometimes they're handled as a jack of all trades, one person band, type of situation. Ideally, you have more of a bench where you can really have more of a focus on what you are best at, and you allow your team to support in other areas, such as having somebody focused just on social media, someone focused on just influencer management, someone just on interfacing with the devs and acting as your community producer, if you will. But I know that the folks we have assembled here are too familiar with being a community team of one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I was thinking the same thing when you were saying that. I mean, I think the thing about that phrase "jack of all trades" is, of course, the second half of that is master of none, right? So that's why sometimes it can be sort of seen as a backhanded compliment. But like, I think part of the thing about the widening remit of CMs over the years has really just been that things have changed, right? Like, I know certainly when Linda and I started, it was basically forums, and that was pretty much it, right? Maybe web pages, blogs, but all of it was written. Live streaming wasn't a thing. YouTube wasn't a thing, and social media certainly wasn't a thing, right? So a lot of that stuff, when it came along, just kind of got added in. And for smaller teams, yeah, that was, just a widening of the CM responsibilities. Smart companies would expand and realize that there were multiple, things that were going on here and multiple tracks. One of the perennial problems with the title is that it can be perceived as anything from essentially something that the intern can do if you just throw them some, a laptop or something, all the way up to, someone who's running a team or at least is in charge of a lot of channels on, a global brand, right? Those people can both have the same title, right? Which is kind of wild. So yeah, we've obviously grown in responsibility, and then the difficulty in a way has been that over the years, people coming in at different times, you don't necessarily come in and end up learning all of that stuff. It kind of just depends on where you get thrown in, right? So people might come in and start doing social media stuff, or they might start doing live streaming and so on. And it's honestly not that dissimilar to the way the game studios are structured, right? The bigger the game studio, or I suppose the higher tier, when we talk about, AAA versus AA or whatever these things mean, the more specialized that you tend to find people within those development teams, right? So all the way down to, texture artists or something like that, which is not in any way a low ranking job, just a very specialized job, right? So on bigger community teams, there's obviously going to be specialists, but honestly, that's not very often the case, because the feeling is just like, well, you can just do it all, right? Which is honestly, I think, why we have quite a lot of burnout and, people who don't last in the industry, because it is very high stress. Because on top of everything you have to do and everything you have to learn, you're also constantly in frontline communication with fans who may or may not be happy, but most of the time they're not happy, at least not universally. Things are going well if you can get, I would say, 75% of your player base to be, happy about things, but it's a high stress job as a result. So yeah, it's like high qualification, high expectations for performance, and then high pressure in terms of what you have to deal with on a daily basis.
Stephen, it's interesting you mention the I won't even say humble, but the origins of the role being so focused on BBSs, MIRC, etc. I have an anecdote that I always think about every now and then, which is on the first product that I was on in 2007, Hellgate London. Us responding to the comments section of a YouTube video was novel enough at the time to actually generate coverage. Massively, or MMORPG.com, I can't remember which.
Really? Wow.
Flagship Studios innovating new way to engage with players. I'm sure I could find it in archive.org, or like in a web archive or something like that at some point. But
and you know what? No, you know what's funny? I've been reading recently that apparently the current meta across social, Instagram, whatever, is apparently replying in the comments. That is the thing that literally big brands are now like pivoting their teams, and we're all just like, how is that surprising to anybody? But we did it first. I mean, it's fair to say.
Linda, how have things changed for you? Like you've seen community management evolve. Like I think Stephen touched on the idea of like being a CM, 15, 20 years ago it still has kind of those fundamental tenets, but a lot has changed. Okay, well, we lost Linda for a sec.
She probably clicked the wrong button.
Oops.
But yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I'm sure she'll say the same thing. You know, like she's seen everything.
Hopefully
like,
I didn't
well,
just
all of
lose
us.
connection.
Wasn't that Blade Runner quote? You know, I've seen things you wouldn't believe, etc. I think the
off
real
the 10,000 gate.
yeah, the real interesting question is like, you know, what do we see next? And I personally have also seen the wheel has kind of come all the way around again, right? Like we are starting to see more of a pushback towards not text-based communities, but in the place of, you know, social and all that kind of thing, which has sort of become algorithmically, you know, difficult, for lack of a better term, you see people turning to things like private WhatsApp groups and, you know, signal chats or, you know, private spaces, right? And Discord also, to a certain degree, is that because Discord's, you still have to be invited to one or you have to join it specifically. So it's not the same as like broadcasting into the ether where you would do on a social media platform, right? So even in the Discord and even with a large Discord, it's still a private group, right? That they're communicating with either as a CM or as a player, you know. So we've kind of come around again, and I think that increasingly has become a bigger thing. And also these days, there's a large amount of community platforms that are coming back to that first principle of like, you know, discussion posts and forums and threads and, you know, that kind of thing. So everything old is new again, as they say.
Yeah, apologies for dropping there. There's a lot going on. So the biggest changes I have seen, as Stephen mentioned, are the platforms. You just can't keep up. There are dozens of them out there. So my usual advice to any company that's starting out, or even to the larger companies, is like, sure, go in, reserve your name on that platform, your game's name on that platform, but you have to follow where the players are. You can't force them to go to Blue Sky if they don't want to go there. You can't force them to move from X to Discord if they don't want to go there. You'll get a subset of players on each of these platforms. So you need to study where the players are and invest your time where they already are, because that's where that particular play style wants to congregate. But yeah, the plethora of platforms is insane, and there is still no one-size-fits-all aggregator that I can rely on to really take me from one to the other efficiently. And each one has a different tone, a different style, and you have to adapt your own tone and style to match the communications that are being used. And now, of course, the young kids these days, I say being so freaking old myself, I'm getting used to the fact that they like to communicate in emojis and GIFs and nothing else. Like, where's the words, people? You don't even know how to type anymore. It's constantly changing. And because we're in a technological field, that change comes around every single day. Every week there's something new going on.
So how do you avoid the problem of when you're using social media and you're talking to players? A lot of the most vocal players tend to be, I don't want to say power users, but you're talking to maybe a very like vocal 20% of the audience, right? Like those are the ones that are online, they're communicating, especially the ones on Reddit, maybe even more so on Discord. How do you balance that? Because I found myself making this error when I was working kind of on a live service game where I was listening to these users on Discord and I was taking so much of what they were saying into account. But at some point I realized I'm not taking into account the whole player base. Like there's a silent majority that just kind of just plays the game and they may not communicate as fervently.
Glad to kind of dive into this one. I know that, again, Linda and I have discussed this at length separately, but this is what's known as the 99-1 principle. It refers to Zipf's law of frequency ratios. It's called the 1% rule. It's got a lot of different names. The notion is if you think of your community as an iceberg, your most vocals are going to be these heavy contributors that are emerging above the waves. The thing is that those people, the study was from, that I based this off as, let's see, I'm actually pulling up my notes here because I've done presentations on this, but basically Nielsen back in 2006, seems like a long time ago, still pretty relevant, indicated that 1% of users in online communities tended to generate 90% of the postings. The inference of this was that 90% of the users made no postings at all. So essentially you had this quiet majority who were sometimes being represented, sometimes being misrepresented by the vocal minority. And so it really became a matter to how on how you basically slice the information that's coming in terms of signals noise. You identify what topics are actually going to be impactful, what the velocity is, basically how much of it is happening, what the severity is, how bad it is that it's happening. This can also be not just negative topics, but also positive topics as well. If your players are really happy about a change, you still would want to measure the impact of that as well. But you take all that data and you're presenting it in an actual way to your team where they can actually say, oh, well, players aren't all upset about the fact that the armor is green. There's a subset who are. Here's how much we need to worry about it in comparison to the bow is red, whatever it is. And so essentially it's a matter of taking this information, making sure that you're still representing your most talkative users, your super users, but also trying to figure out, is it actually representative of what your greater player base is actually thinking and feeling?
I was going to say, and I'm sure Evan can't talk about this because it's proprietary info. But what I was going to say is, for me, it was always looking at the game data and whatever game data that we had available to us, right? It was amazing to me how many times you would see an opinion, which is on forums or social media, wherever, right? It's just gaining traction within the community. And people will say, like, everybody knows that everybody hates blah, right? And then you go look at the game stats and you're like, oh, it's the second most used blah, right? So that's clearly not true, right? And sometimes the reasons for that are because either, the silent majority are just using it and having fun. Sometimes, and quite often actually in MMOs, it's there's some sort of glitch, or it can basically break the game in some format, and players never want to admit to that, right? So there's often a disparity between the data about the game itself and what the players are telling you. So it's obviously important for you to have good relationships with your data analysts, whoever is looking at those kind of statistics on the team. And of course, also you need to make sure the game is built in a way that you can actually do that kind of analysis, right? And this is where the kind of the data analytics sort of stuff comes in. The one thing I'll say is that one thing that's always sort of not surprised me, but I've come to realize, if any prevailing opinion is being like sweeping across the forums, almost always you'll see some sort of counter to that, which doesn't mean that the counter is right, but it does give you a better idea of like, okay, there are people who think that this isn't true or they disagree, because a lot of the topics that people kind of get very incensed about are often just they're qualitative opinions, right? They're subjective based on the players, right? It can be very, very difficult if they're saying things like, oh, it just doesn't feel as fun as it used to, right? Like, whatever you've done to this class, it doesn't feel as good, or this area isn't as fun as it was. And digging down into that and understanding why that's the case is often a tricky thing to do. And also understanding why people are upset is often quite hard, although the answer is normally because they're just annoyed about something and they want someone to complain to. But I do find that sort of counter opinion often comes up, which helps you realize that there is another opinion out there, and will often kind of potentially mobilize people to posting or talking about something that they haven't before. You'll see people say, I don't normally post, or I never post in here, or whatever, but I had to say, right? And then you'll find that silent majority or whatever gets their opinion known as well, But it's a constant thing, as Evan said. It's like you're always telling yourself, I got to remember this is not necessarily the opinion of everybody, because it's far too easy to just assume that's the case and then go off and make decisions based off of that.
I have opinions on this topic. I have lots of opinions on this topic, and I've spent years arguing with devs to get them to listen to my way of doing things. For one thing, we know that data is quantitative, but data lies because it takes out the emotion and the opinion of people. So, for instance, a dev team might say, well, people are really loving this new content. They're running, this series of quests, and they're spending lots of time on them. Yeah, but they hate it, right? When you go into game, and you should be sitting in game, listening to players, if you have any sort of chat in game, they hate it because they feel like they're being forced to do it. They despise it, but they need it to do progress. Just because they're doing something a lot doesn't mean that they approve of it. The second thing, as Evan was talking about the vocal minority, that exists everywhere. There are people who talk a lot and there's people who don't talk a lot. The people who talk a lot are also typically very good at rallying other people to support their opinions. So that tends to snowball. When you find that something is really objectionable to players, there is typically what I like to call the 7-day rule. Let it go, listen to all the opinions, let people say what they want to say, and within about day 3, people are starting to reconsider. More rational, saner voices are joining the conversation. Things start to settle down. People start to understand or accept what you're putting out there. That's assuming that the decision wasn't just fundamentally bad in the first place. But after 7 days, people have normalized things and they understand it from all possible sides of the equation. And that's very, very healthy for the community. The other thing is, if you really want players' opinions and you know that most of them are not going to Discord or to your forums or whatever else you've got, I have found that the best way to find out about things is to create short, targeted surveys that are presented in-game. That's where the players are. And if you make your surveys really short, please do not make them the 30-minute, 45-minute investment that I'll still do them, but I'm angry at you while I'm doing them. But if it's a short survey, if it literally takes me 3 minutes, if it's on just 1 or 2 topics, I will fill those in every time, and quite honestly. So there, that's my opinion on the topic.
I'm really glad that you touched on quantitative because, yeah, that's something which community sometimes gets flagged with a lot, that we seem to be more qualitative. We tend to be more, again, soft skills is thrown in there too, but really the argument of quantitative and qualitative, you really need both. And to actually tie into what Steve was talking about, pairing it with telemetry from the game is the best way to verify, hey, we're seeing this come in from players. Let's validate, let's vet what we're actually seeing against what we're seeing in terms of gameplay. Sometimes there's correlation, sometimes there isn't, but it at least then gives you that sense of, well, I'm hearing this from our super users, I'm hearing this from our baseline, I'm hearing this from, whether, to lend to your point on regular surveys are indicating this as a friction point, whatever. And then we actually see, when players are playing this content, their play sessions are shorter. Their satisfaction, if we have sort of an in-game satisfaction measurement tool, some games have this, is less, whatever it is. So yeah, pairing what we're doing in terms of harvesting and collecting and listening, holding a microphone up to the players, to then also pairing that with what the game is telling us in terms of what players are actually doing, allows us to then take real, meaningful, actionable insights. Turn these insights rather into action, is what I mean to say there. I'll also tie in one more thing on what Linda mentioned. The 7-day approach is something I've always paired to an Oregon Trail. When you would approach a river, you had a couple of options. You could ford the river, you could try going straight across, or you could wait and see if conditions improved. Now, you didn't usually go for that option. You usually try to ford the river, and it'd be hilarious when the oxen all fell into the water and you lost your clothing and everything. But basically, wait and see if conditions improve is a completely valid community management strategy. As in, if you are seeing that there's a moment right now that is big and it's building, it's sometimes best to see, okay, is it a bubble? Is it going to sustain? Is this going to become a news cycle? Or if we let it lie, if we see if there's going to be a second beat to it, if the rest of the community starts listening in on what's going on and they start sharing their greater opinions, we may get a bigger picture of what's happening and be able to take a more appropriate response to it.
Let me add, and I want to press all three of you guys on this. There's a need for personas. Like when we think about like MMOs, which I think is a large part of what I'd like to explore today with being a community management team and working on it. You need to understand all these different players that play. Like you have your PvPer, you have your PvMer, you have the player who's just collecting things and waiting to log in for the new mount or whatever. Like there's just a myriad of different types of players. And yet, when we think of the analytics, I think a lot of studios are looking at like top level analytics, and maybe obviously it can kind of become a bit more specific. But I just wonder, how can you balance kind of obviously sending out those targeted surveys like Linda mentioned, looking potentially at the quantitative analytics, and then obviously the qualitative that's being told on social media. But at this end of the day, I want to understand what type of players are playing what and doing what, right?
Yeah, no, it is difficult. Like, you could, in theory, with really good telemetry, you could try and figure out, like, okay, is this a PvP person, PvE? And there's some fairly obvious indicators of that. But it's also difficult to know, what kind of player they are beyond that. Um, I think you could get into that level of detail, but I haven't seen many studios do it. So I think a lot of the time it's more, what do you call it? Self-declaration, right? People will say like, "Hey, I'm more of a PvE than a PvP guy," and yeah, you could go off and look at that telemetry and make that assessment. Um, so yeah, it's difficult to know, and a lot of the time for me, I mean, frankly, in my experience, it's been pretty rare that the telemetry's been that tight that you can go in and get that kind of profile information, right? Like, it's only, I don't know whether it's changed in the last few years, but I haven't been in a live studio where they've had dashboards on like player behavior, but maybe that's something that exists now. It could theoretically, and I think it will be a great thing to have, but it's not something I've dealt with in the past. So a lot of the time, it was kind of just assume that they're not lying to you because they don't really have any reason to do so.
Yeah, I think something that has definitely been developing over recent years, to your point, Stephen, is yeah, when I was at smaller studios, 10 years ago or whatever, we would have discussions about how great it would be to be able to peek under the hood and actually get that telemetry at that particular touch point where players were engaging with a particular piece of content.
Mm.
It just didn't exist. Like it was, oh yeah, that'd be great to have, but we're not a data company. We don't have we're not tracking against this. Over the recent years, it's become sort of de rigueur to have that, to actually be able to take a look and track whether it's population per particular activity in the game, what play sessions look like, getting insight into what's really moving the needle for players, what's really keeping them playing the core gameplay loop longer, and just frankly generating fun and joy. And it's been very interesting as a community manager, and this is kind of tying back to what we talked about earlier, is again going from, well, we're more communications focused, we're one to many, we're putting out no, now we're actually being able to be part of these conversations with these data scientists who are joining teams and these user research teams inside of bigger companies, and being able to have that inform how we engage with players is a very powerful value add to what we're doing. It's been really exciting to be able to take the theory and then pair it with the data that we then get from these internal resources and have our communications be that much more, not just like on topic, but also what folks are actually looking for to make the difference as to whether they continue playing or not. So no, it's been really exciting to, again, to Stephen's point on how it's gone from a nice to have to, oh, this is now just kind of standard for what studios will do to make sure that they are keenly aware of what players are talking about.
Yeah, because if not, like, if you don't have a CM present for a project or for a certain update that you're building, you may not have that kind of person in the loop that really understands kind of what the player base is saying, but also has like a gut instinct, right? We've talked so much about kind of this idea that you're looking at the qualitative, the quantitative, but you have like, you love this game. I think CMs like particularly understand the community, understand the passion behind it. And there's this idea of gut, right? I felt a certain way when I worked in the last live service game that I kind of worked for in a product level. And I could feel in my gut that like players felt this way for a certain reason. And it doesn't mean that I was correct. I could always corroborate that with kind of analytics, with kind of what I'm seeing on Reddit, sentiment. But there was something that came from, I feel that this could be good. Linda, how does gut play for you in community management?
Okay, full confession here. I keep being kicked out because I've got video links, video uploads, hundreds of people entering our closed beta, which just launched this morning. It's a zoo out there. But it does remind me that were we just talking about gut feel?
Yeah, gut feel.
It's an intangible. So let's say you're looking at a painting of a horse, and it's not anatomically correct. You can't quite put your finger on it, but there's something wrong with it, and that's gut feel. Gut feel is when I log into my Discord server and you just get a really quick feeling for how people are reacting that day. Has something gone out that's making them uneasy? What are their concerns? You definitely get that gut feel. But you can't just go to dev with that gut feel. You do have to take the time, get those analytics, get more detail about what's going on, experience it firsthand if you can. All community managers should also play the games that they're in charge of. We have to understand it from the gamer's perspective. I go far enough to say that I will never accept a free account from a company. I won't accept free stuff from a company. I have to be a player. How else am I going to know whether something is overpriced or not? I have to, is it worth it to me to buy it in game? Is this season's pass? How does that feel to me to spend money on that? How does it feel to me to play it? Putting yourself in the player's shoes is very important. I also I'm very fortunate to live in a large house with 3 generations of gamers. And that means that I can get a gut feel check from them as well, because they are not going to be shy to tell me how they feel. But mostly you'll get it from the players. The two-way communication is absolutely critical in any community environment. You have to talk to the players. You have to hear back from them. If you're not getting the information you need, go out and ask the questions that you need answers to. That'll all back up your gut feel, and then you can package it up in a way that dev can actually use it, because they just can't go on just gut feel. There's a lot of work involved.
I'll just do a quick chime in here. Linda, I recall when we were working on ArcAge, we were being given codes to be able to get all the mounts and get all the currency and get keys to the end game everything. And I literally have just an audio file in my brain of you saying, no, I want the free-to-play experience. I want the baseline experience. I want to know what the players are going to be experiencing from day one, not what they'll be experiencing when they're reaching end game. And that has stuck with me for years, because that was, 2015, 2016? Sorry.
Reminded me of how old we are.
Sorry, I realized as soon as that was 10 years ago. Shit.
I will say also at this point, and having Stephen in the chat as well, I think we learn more from our fellow community managers, and the free sharing of knowledge, information, tips and tricks. Oh my God, we're just having this situation. I almost use an F word, but anyway, you know what I mean. We swear a lot amongst ourselves because it's that visceral, but we often do a lot of problem solving just by talking to other community managers, whether they're on similar games or completely different games. Going back to the communication platforms, how do you guys feel like about being on such and such platform for communications? How's that working for you? What tactics do you use? I would be dead in the water without my fellow community managers. It's a small and very close-knit group, and because layoffs are so common in the industry, most of us have a lot of experience on a wide variety of games, and we're only too happy to share knowledge. So if there's any community managers out there listening, reach out to any of us or pretty much any CM that you see online. We're happy to offer our unsolicited opinions and advice.
Just be ready. It'll be kind of unadulterated. It'll be a little raw, but yeah.
Well, then, I mean, Linda, I do want to touch on that generational part then, because you said you live in a house of 3 different generations of players. How have you guys kind of seen this shift? Because like with MMOs, obviously like the player base tends to skew towards late 20s, 30s, like the teenagers that grew up with like the World of Warcrafts, the Everquests, that maybe where they were. I mean, I just spoke to a streamer, World of Warcraft streamer, Ompi, who his parents showed him Everquest when he was like 3 years old and he was playing, and then that incredible story.
Okay, so
how
to your point,
yeah, please.
To your point, the 12-year-old who started playing Everquest with me just turned 40 last year, and we're now playing with his kids. My nephew, who was a couple of years younger than that even, is now the min-maxing lord of everything that he plays. And so generations are interesting. We all prefer a different game style. In our household, we'll usually have a vote. Like in January, everybody played Fortnite. Not my favorite game, but that was the vote, so there we are. In February, we had to go play World of Warcraft, but not just World of Warcraft. Turtle WoW, an emulator, because it's hard and old school, and that's what my 40-year-old son wanted to play. Now, let me just tell you that sometimes it's not so easy to rein in the teens. We have 2 teens and 1 8-year-old. Now, the 8-year-old is very, very keen, but she's very distracted by all the shinies. It's like having a squirrel in your party. And so we're playing World of Warcraft, we're doing PvP, and the boys did not want to play with their little sister and the rest of the family. But as soon as they learned that there's a meta game, it's called Keep Lena Alive at All Costs, because she's a little 8-year-old, we're in a PvP area. It was a nightmare, but they took such pride in keeping her alive and coordinating everything that it opened up a whole new avenue of gameplay for us. I will also say that gaming together removes the generation gap. There's always something to talk about around the family dinner table. The only person in the house that doesn't play is my daughter-in-law, and she thinks we're all absolutely batshit insane. But it's been a wonderful experience, and it's educated me a lot. Seeing how the different ages react to the different games that we play gives me a lot of insight into their thought processes. One of the teens has a lot of patience and will go to a lot of effort to troubleshoot things if a game is really buggy. The other one is the one that just goes, well, screw this, I'm out of here. There's lots of other games to play, and won't even try. So that tells you a lot about how people are reacting to games. And these are the same kids that are going to be making games for the rest of us in the future. I am very encouraged and heartened. I will shut up now because y'all need to talk more.
I think while on the generational topic, it's a little tangential, but it still, I think, is highly relevant. Might notice there's a bunch of board games behind me. I run monthly board game sessions at the house with a bunch of different friends with different age ranges. We just did a rather large social deception game over the weekend with folks from really earliest 20s to late 50s, about like 13, 15 of us or something like that. And it was very insightful to see the level of sort of absorption of the rules, absorption of the core gameplay loop, the flow, how everything worked. And it's insightful even as a video game community manager in seeing, okay, where were the friction points for different age ranges? Was it a matter of the concept or the attention, or where was I seeing people drop off? And so even though it's an analog format, there's still definitely through lines between the two in terms of how can I take this learning and apply it to how I communicate to audiences, measured in the millions.
Where do you see that difference between generations? Because when we think about like live service games, you're especially the ones that last like a very long time. Like these generations are moving ahead, right? Like one thing I saw in old school RuneScape is that you had like a large portion of like the audience that was becoming these gamer dads. And so I personally felt quite strongly as a player that I thought mobile would be a really great thing to keep working on. That's something that I was very passionate about. And so that made me think, like, when you're looking at a community as a community manager, like, of course you want new players to come in. Of course you have your kind of core audience. How do you balance looking at those generational divides? And then again, how do you build a game to sustain both of those? Because you want the game to grow, but you also want to keep your audience, yet kind of demographics shift and change as they get older. So it just feels like a maelstrom of things to consider.
Factors. Game design is, pardon me, something that community managers do tend to find themselves at least at the periphery of, if not sometimes involved in the earliest testing to identify where friction is, where opportunities lie, what makes the game sticky in terms of gameplay. I think what I'll highlight more on is how we communicate. I know I've been focusing a lot on communication, but it is sort of the common core of what a good community manager focuses on. Being able to put out ideas that are going to resonate not just with one subset of the audience, but really multiple segments of that audience is critical. This is done in a number of different ways. One, in the format and the platforms, which we've already talked about a little bit, in terms of going to where our audiences live. It's also in terms of tone and voice. So it's a matter of identifying what the brand voice is. How do I make it more approachable to the lowest common denominator of my audience? And then how do I make sure to retain that level of communication, that level of tone and voice throughout all communications to make for a universal experience no matter where you're touching our brand? I think that's usually the best way, the most common way that community managers will try to be thinking in terms of what segmentation, what cohorts am I trying to reach out to. But it's also a very common thing to be done with individual pieces of content as well, or part of a content strategy in terms of, okay, I have new players coming in. They're the unconverted. They're the top of the marketing funnel. I need to make content that is designed for edutainment, for awareness, for getting them down further into the funnel in terms of consideration. I've got folks also at the same time who are end game raiders, who are people who know my game better than I do, most likely. I need to make sure that I'm also making content that is going to be compelling for them. Then it's a matter of what is the cadence of this content? Where do I ship this content in different areas? Am I talking about in-game, out-of-game, real-world events? At that point, then you're thinking not just in terms of like, I'm just communicating in terms of the brand. I'm communicating then to make sure that the content going out is targeted and has a purpose and has an audience in mind.
Stephen, you've been quiet. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I was sort of thinking that in part, there's very few games that get into the scenario that you're talking about, right? Like when they're old enough to have potentially seen, a complete turnover in player base. WoW's one of them. You mentioned RuneScape, although RuneScape, I guess, has sort of morphed a bit in the last couple of years with a new product. But there are very few that kind of have that. I mean, every studio, of course, hopes that will be, the way that their game turns out, but it's pretty rare, for it to happen. On the smaller scale, as Evan has said, there is always going to be this continuous turnover of players because most people don't play for that long. So you are always constantly aware of those different things. And a lot of that I think is just down to sort of, as he said, like, the kind of content you're putting out, the tone of voice, and also the organization of what you're doing. The other good thing is, of course, is that if you're running the community well, you should hopefully have a welcoming community that is going to bring those new people in and help them out with, the earlier, the newer players. And that's a critical thing to try and foster over time so that people don't get, old and jaded, right? Because, your end game raiders are not going to have the same opinion about those first level zones as the new guy coming in for the first time is. So that's a critical thing to keep in mind. But yeah, it's pretty rare that games get that long and that big. But kudos to those that do. I mean, the project that Linda is working on right now, it's kind of wild to me that we're now at the point not only where, as I understand it, it's not even just a question of we're doing old school EverQuest, maybe with an updated look and feel or whatever. But it sounds like it's the exact same game as was launched back in the 90s. Although I guess we're not playing on dial-up now, so that's good. Or is it? We've got a dial-up simulation layer?
Oh, I tell you, when I first started playing EverQuest, I was on a party line. You can imagine how annoyed other people got when I was online. But the game I'm working on is EverQuest Legends, and it is EverQuest, but it's also created for an audience that EverQuest lost many years ago. Literally people like myself who we ran out of time for the 8-hour camps. We ran out of time to try to slowly gather all of the stuff that we needed to be powerful enough to get on a raid. There's nothing more humbling than being the global director of community relations for a game, loving the game, living the game, and then being told that you're not geared enough to go on raids, right? So this version of EverQuest is definitely a casual version of EverQuest. You might call it your dad's version of EverQuest. Marketing's going to kill me for that, but it's a completely different way of presenting a game. But it also brings me to the fact that games evolve and you might lose part of your audience. Or games don't evolve and you might lose part of your audience that's evolved past there. The bottom line is it's never one size fits all. You're never going to capture 100% of the player base. Even of your existing player base, you're never going to make 100% of them happy. And it's a matter of balancing and evolving and trying to do the best you can to keep the dialogue going between development and the gamers And then hard decisions have to be made. Somebody at the producer level has to decide what's going in an expansion, what's happening with a certain line of gear or loot, or what are we putting in the marketplace now. And some people will love it and some people will hate it. And you're hoping that the majority is at least okay with it. It's a really tough job. I love community management. I would hate to be a producer.
I just want to quickly interject. You brought me to the next kind of question I wanted to pose to all three of you, which is, how do you deal with nostalgia? This is something that I dealt with directly, because like you see it, it's this. In some ways, you can look at nostalgia as a bit irrational because things do change. Games have to evolve. There are needs that perhaps go beyond just the game itself. Like the game has to you got to keep the lights on and everything. But at the same time, it's also very real and very true. Like players who play these virtual games, these virtual worlds, they inhabit them. It becomes a part of them. They create these like shared memories. Like it, I feel it a certain way with World of Warcraft, right? Like once like World of Warcraft moved on through all the different expansions, I'd come back and say like, this is not the same game that I used to play. So, Evan, I'll go to you first. Like, how do you deal with something like nostalgia, where kind of at face value, like maybe a bit irrational, but also very rational and real because there's an emotional element?
Just to be clear, nostalgia in terms of players who have been part of a community for a long time and have more of a sense memory going back to an earlier phase of a game's life?
I would say yes. I think the incredible thing about nostalgia is that like you can both look at like, I don't know, I'll say from World of Warcraft terms, you can look at Goldshire in Elwyn Forest, and it can remind you of like how you used to play with your guild, how you used to interact, like maybe that time of your life, but at the same time you also judge it based on kind of the game and how you can play it. Like again, I wish I could give you an exact definition. I just find it so, right?
I think I'm picking up what you're putting down. The notion of, especially games that have, whether it's games or franchises that have, a longer life, you're able to then, as a communicator, trust that your audience is going to get your references. You can, make jokes, you can make memes, you can do throwbacks, deep cuts. And this allows you to have sort of a common tongue, if you will, with players who, some may have lapsed, some may have not been back in a while, some may be, just returning for a new update. But there still is a commonality in terms of what they are expecting from a particular title. And you can essentially communicate with them in a way that you'd not be able to with someone who is newer to your audience, people who haven't yet sort of come into the fold, who don't have those memories to rely on. So I think that there are opportunities when it comes to engaging your graybeards, your people who have been with you since the beginning, the folks who are the hardcores, if you will, and it definitely affords you a different level of communication that is wholly different than when you are launching a new spunky indie title that is just starting to get its community together, just beginning to find its people. There, it's much more of really kind of cracking a new glossary, trying to establish those first emotional bonds with the product to then be able to rely on, hopefully, in that game's future as well. So, yes, essentially, as you have older games, there are ways to really tap into nostalgia as something to bring them back to a time where they were playing this perhaps back in college or at the birth of their first kid or when they were themselves, just finishing up school or what have you. So it's a powerful tool, but it definitely requires a lot of investment on the behalf of the player to leverage.
I think Linda is going to have a great perspective on this because you've certainly worked on a lot of long-lasting titles over the years. One thing I sort of feel about the sort of nostalgic element is, in part, it can never properly be captured, right? But that's just nostalgia as a definition, right? Like you're yearning for something in the past that you cannot get back, right? So you can't fully recreate the actual experience of what it was like to play when you were a teenager or in college or whatever it had to be, because there's only so much the game can do. The other thing that I'm a little skeptical of is that I think there is a tendency from a commercial point of view to try and push that nostalgic feeling because you're sort of trying to keep a hold of a player base that might potentially be drifting away, right? Because I feel like over time, this is wavered a bit in the last few years with the kind of increase in indie gaming and the more varied art styles and that kind of thing. But generally speaking, the push of the games industry, partly because of the fact that it helps with things like hardware sales, has always been like better graphics, more immersive experiences, and so on and so forth. There's kind of a danger in that nostalgic feeling because it's like, well, that's not really what we want, right? We want you to buy Call of Duty 7 because, even though you love Call of Duty 1, Call of Duty 7 is what we need to sell the latest console or the latest graphics card or just to make, quarterly numbers, right? So that's tricky. To bring it back to a community sense, though, the other difficult thing about nostalgia is a lot of the time when people say that they're nostalgic for a community, they're usually talking about the community when it was smaller, right? Because usually, like that early feel when you come in and you feel like you know everybody, or at least you have a handle on everything that's going on. And also, of course, you're all talking about things that are new and you're discovering stuff that's new. That's a very different feeling than, an older and more mature community, and that's just life, you know. So yeah, to a certain degree, I don't know. Maybe I'm being harsh, but a lot of the time with that sort of nostalgic thing, I'm kind of more of a. I mean, I'm as nostalgic as the next guy. I mean, look at the thing I've got over my head. But a 45-year-old movie. But it's a dangerous thing, especially within communities because a lot of the time, because it's backwards looking, it just goes against essentially the things in theory that you've learned about the game, right? And hopefully, improved it over time.
Linda, did you want to? Oh, just a second. I think
Yeah,
Linda's
my
unmuted. I want to
apologies.
definitely.
Everything's
No
moving
worries.
so slowly. It takes me a while to get to the microphone button. We just put up a new video on YouTube. This is the life of a community manager. Plates spinning, everything crashing. It's
In
all
real
awesome.
time.
In real time.
In real time.
Yeah, there we go.
Just look at when you see my face and I'm going like this, and then if I go like this, you know that something went wrong. Nostalgia is a real thing, and it is the reason my son dragged us into a much older version of World of Warcraft than what's available on retail. My brother won't play anything other than retail. Him and his wife, they love the retail version. My son, it's like, oh, like you could just face roll that. A monkey could type on the keyboard and play that. Everyone's got something different. He likes the old school stuff. That's what he wanted to introduce his kids to. There's a reason why time lock progression servers exist on a lot of the older games. It's so that people can, go through that experience again. Is it ever exactly the same? Not usually. I mean, some come closer than others. But nostalgia's a real thing. When you go through your closet and you see an old T-shirt for a game that you haven't played for years, maybe it doesn't even exist anymore, but it still brings you those warm memories, and then you might end up talking with some people who used to play it with, and that's what humanity's about. We're all about memory and emotion, making connections, making friendships, losing some of them along the way, and then reconnecting in future. It's the human state of being, and it's pretty glorious.
So then, I wanna pivot a bit then because I think I'm very happy with all the perspectives on nostalgia. I've learned quite a bit just listening. Streaming has become a big part of kind of community building, right? Like 15 years ago, you didn't have these incredible streamers that had these captivating audiences, all these players watching, to the point where you could say a number of people are not playing the game as much as they are watching someone else play the game, which maybe like 10, 15 years ago would have been a crazy kind of thing to say. It's like, why wouldn't you play? Like, why would you watch someone else? But I just want to kind of hear your thoughts. Evan, I'll start with you on like, how do you guys interpret streaming as community managers? Because it is like a single person that has like a big community behind them, and I think it's very positive. It can be tricky.
All that is true. No, let's see. To kind of take it a step back, what we're seeing with streamers, YouTubers, is not dissimilar to what we experienced as community managers 20 years ago, when you would have a fan site admin, a guild leader. Back then cosplayer was, I think, really adopted as a term much later on, but people who did dress up and go to events. Basically, the Modern live streamer or YouTuber is effectively a super user, not unlike the super users that we would really work with going back years and years. They essentially are sort of bubbles within your community or sub communities. They are sometimes fully immersed, as in they are purely focused on just your title. It's basically where your game is their primary game. It's what their audience comes to see. Other times they could be more variety YouTubers or streamers, where it's essentially them taste testing and seeing if they want to taste make of your title, see if it's a fit for their audience. And so then there's sort of more of like a external community bubble, if you will. But engaging with them is, again, no different than the the VIP programs of old. Now, these were things that, or essentially, you would identify who amongst your community, and this is again going back to forums, going back to even MIRC, where the people who had clout, power, sway, were able to change hearts and minds on a scale that was more than someone with their immediate social circle. Essentially, they could act as amplifiers for what you were trying to get out there into the community in terms of either whether it was upcoming game updates or it was corrective messaging or it was, trying to, ameliorate a situation or clarify a situation. And essentially what these new video-based platforms allow for is all of that power sort of at a far more accessible level than ever before. The fact that you can create fan sites faster than ever, you can create wikis faster than ever, you can have really very sophisticated video presences on these platforms basically allows for more of your community to become super users than ever before. This is a fantastic opportunity for any community manager in that, again, by bringing them into the fold early, by whether it was a matter of, hey, we're just going to give you access on like a monthly cadence to, whether it's some people call them town halls, otherwise it would be a newsletter, otherwise it'd be like a stipend every now and then of some premium currency, early access to things, the ability to, not leak, but be able to drop information early. I can think of Temple Bethesda would give out previews of the cards of the trading card game, the trading card game that we did there for Elder Scrolls, for instance. And it was essentially like, oh, you guys have these great platforms, here's previews of the new expansion, and let them run with that. So essentially, it's a different level of relationship. It does also tend to be something which gets sectioned off to a influencer manager who will focus purely on that level of interaction, because the nature of those relationships also require more one-to-one and less one-to-many for them to really be not just productive, but also just to be respectful of their time as well, to really see them as essentially a brand in and of themselves that requires almost more of a B2B relationship as opposed to a B2C relationship. I've spoken a lot on this. I really want to hear what everyone else has to say on it. But essentially, the modern advent of accessible video production and broadcasting it has been just fantastic to see, both as folks who did ourselves, whether it was us broadcasting our own live streams for, us to reach more audiences, but also more importantly, to see what our players do with it and make fantastic communities of their own.
I just want
Stephen? Oh, go ahead.
to
Sorry.
home in on one thing, which is that you mentioned, why would it be that people would potentially watch somebody play rather than play themselves? I think obviously everybody's motivation is going to be different, right? But obviously this is not limited to MMOs by any means. Like many people will watch a lot of streamers and not play the games that they're playing. And sometimes that's for various reasons, this isn't the kind of game I would normally buy, or, I just enjoy watching this guy play regardless of what it is. But with MMOs in particular, I think there's certainly an element of either or both knowledge sharing, right? Like, oh, okay, this person knows what they're doing and they're playing the game, and I can, potentially get tips from them. Obviously, their personality and how they stream and who they stream with, because but often it's not alone. And then also they will sometimes be playing content that you aren't going to get to yourself, or you just don't have the time to get to yourself, and you can be like, okay, I can watch this guy raiding, this high level dungeon, which I'd never normally be able to get to. So I think there's a variety of different reasons why. In terms of the role that they play with CMs and stuff, Evan's spot on, is that these days we just really call them influencers, and they're obviously across multiple platforms, right? Streaming was kind of the sort of the tip of the spear because it made a lot more sense because it was a longer form piece of content, and generally speaking, you can't sort of dip in and out of MMOs. But now, whether it's MMOs or any kind of game, really, everybody is doing short form video as well. So, arguably, sometimes the success of a game will go hand in hand with how well it can potentially play on those platforms. I mentioned Fortnite earlier on, but as an example, that's a great one because you can obviously show kills, you can show, moments that you are really impressive, and that can be something that people will be interested in, and that obviously boosts your content, right? It's a little harder to potentially show you playing a raid for 3 hours and then cutting that down into a way that's going to be exciting, to look at. But I think things have changed over the years. There was definitely a time when I feel like there was a belief that influencers were more on the side of journalism and media coverage. So, I've been in companies where it was assigned as essentially a PR or comms function to handle. And yeah, very much B2B in those scenarios. But I've also been in situations where probably a little bit pre-influencer era, but when I was on Star Wars, we had a whole program about fan sites and just working with those guys individually. We did treat them as journalists, but at the same time, you understood that they were, fans first, really. And that kind of just changes what you're going to offer to them, and usually changes the relationship, somewhat. I think these days it tends to be more, even though companies will reach out to and work with influencers, a lot of the ones out there are not in direct contact with those companies. And then, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on who said this, but maybe it was Evan, but essentially every one of those people is like a super user in that they can go on and broadcast their stuff and talk about their experiences. And there's really nothing you can do about it from, a community perspective. So that is another example of like, okay, there's going to be community feedback coming in from this area, right? And they obviously have influence because unlike, if you're the top 1% poster on a message board, you're still only necessarily, reaching those people on a message board, right? A massive level influencer who has an enormous, crowd presence, fan presence and viewership can have a very serious effect on a game, good and bad, right? So, it's a difficult area to deal with because you do have to get into that conversation with them. And sometimes it can be comms based, as in a professional level conversation. And other times it's very much, one-to-one, right? It's sliding into their DMs and being like, hi, I'm from the company. Can I help you with something? Or is there anything you need to know or whatever, right? It really does vary according to the person.
Okay, my turn. It used to be that tastemakers were heavily curated. You had PC Gamer, you had a couple of other magazines, and that's about it. And then we had the fan sites; those people became tastemakers, and you'd cultivate them the same as PR would cultivate a bunch of journalists that worked for magazines. Most of the magazines have moved online now, and that still continues. These are people that have a lot more weight to their opinions. But now you've got live streamers. They tend to be, I'd like to say authentic, but sometimes they will exploit issues just to get more eyeballs for being contrarians. I mean, you have to get views in order to make money. But it really leveled the playing field. It meant that you no longer had to have a degree in journalism to get a role to express your opinions. You just had to have a webcam and a microphone and some words to say. I think it's actually very healthy, and again, it gets discussions going. Anytime your game is mentioned, anytime your community is activated and they're having these discussions, it's usually healthy for your game, unless, of course, your game has already made some grievous errors, which they are now reaping the terrible rewards thereof. But I think it's healthy. I don't watch a lot of the streamers myself, but I know a lot of people who do, and the reason they give is because, well, gaming can be stressful and it's a lot of work, and sometimes I like to just sit back and chill and watch somebody else play because we have no friends living close by. I'll just watch somebody else play, and it's kind of like watching a friend. It's just something to do. Why do people watch television at all? It's we are a viewing species. And I'll keep mine short so we can move
Aren't
on
they?
to the next topic.
No. Sorry, Evan. Please, if you want to add, please do.
Sorry, I was just gonna because it's actually relevant to both what Linda and Stephen were both saying earlier. The I chuckled when Stephen was talking about the earliest notions rather of when we were starting to have streamers broadcast and folks watch. I have a very clear memory of some marketing manager at one of my earlier studios. What do you mean that they're just watching them play? Why aren't they playing the game themselves? And then flash forward 10, 15 years down the road, and they have so many people watching our game. It was such a shift in perception of, well, wait, I don't understand why this is compelling. And now it is just so clearly understood that these are folks who have great dedicated audiences. They do convert into the game if the influencer, if the streamer, if the videographer basically indicates that they are enjoying their time in it, or there's merit to it, or they've essentially vetted it. So it's been very interesting seeing that shift go from again sort of being stymied originally, I think, by like, well, we don't quite understand this, to seeing the impact, seeing how there's such opportunity by engaging. And so sorry, just sort of remarking on that, seeing the shift over the last, again, 10 plus years.
Marketing now sees it as not a waste of time. Why aren't these people in our game? You're stealing people from our game. It's more like, look at this. It's a 45-minute advertisement for our game. This is awesome. The cost per click is very low.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I would add that you have the streamers I've spoken to, but most of the streamers, especially if they're dedicated to a particular game. So you have like a streamer that maybe only plays World of Warcraft, or may only play old school RuneScape, or whatever game it may be. In a lot of ways, their job is to play the game a heavy amount of hours every day and interact with a community of gamers and talk about that game constantly. So like they're constantly giving their thoughts, looking at the chat, because you ever watch a streamer play, they kind of got their eye glancing at like this live chat of people just giving them feedback. And so they may be talking about like a quest or some idea for the next expansion or the next update. And they're getting like this live sounding board of people, which you could say, yeah, sure, it's their audience. So maybe you could factor them in as homogenous. But to me, it's like we should be leaning on these streamers as much as possible. Like, and again, you pick the ones that obviously really represent the game and the community and everything. And I'm sure there's a way of doing due diligence, but at least with the streamers I've spoken to, and I've been lucky enough to have on stream, they have such incredible opinions about the game and the future of it. And they don't say they're right, but if I were a game studio, I would be trying to bring them in. I'd be trying to kind of get them to help us unpack like what we should be doing, where the problems lie. Is that a strategy that you guys have seen like evolving like in CM?
Yeah, often. When at Trion, we would do events at conventions where they were already collecting. When I was at NMAS, I did a community day event where we would bring in not just the streaming folks, but also folks, again, who were running guilds, who were running fan sites, the subreddit, things of that nature. Absolutely. It's, again, going back to the VIP program concept that we talked about earlier, where, if these folks are going to put in the extra effort to go above and beyond, simply playing the game, and I say simply not to, put that down whatsoever. It's great that folks are dedicated to a product, but if folks are going to go above and beyond and create content, build a community around a concept, build something ancillary to the game, but also supportive and constructive of the game, it is a true benefit to retain them, to reward them, to acknowledge them, and to keep them making cool stuff, because that's just a boon to any studio.
Yeah, I mean it's pretty much a no-brainer. As Linda said, like now you can sort of see them as being a 45-minute ad for the game. I mean, if anything, the issue is when their audience potentially stops to believe that they're actually being honest about their opinions, right? Because now we have, I mean, this is kind of, well, actually, no, it has not always been the case, in that there hasn't always been a situation where a publisher or whatever goes up, and it's always been tried. I mean, it's been tried since the birth of media, right? To try and bribe the media, get a favorable opinion out of them. These days, though, And even though there are laws around it, you will find that streamers, influencers, or whatever can be in actual deals with companies, right? So I think one of the reasons why that whole thing never really stays the same, and people will move on and graduate or move to and from different streamers, is partly that question of like, okay, are they doing this for fun, or are they doing it because they're being paid by the company? And I think the majority of them are going to be upfront about it, but that's definitely entered the equation as a thing to be aware of. I think when it started, it was very much like, well, they're just super fans, and they just love the game, the title, whatever. That's a lot easier to deal with from a community management point of view, because it's like, okay, this is a super fan. That's their whole reason for being. Whereas that's why the influencer management role has become a big thing in the last, as Evan says, around 10ish years, maybe a little less, because you now are dealing with people who essentially can have um, a revenue effect on your game, right? Like, if they like it, great. If they hate it, not good. So you got to treat them seriously.
There's also, I mean, right now it's a requirement. It is a legal requirement to disclose if you are getting any sort of compensation from the game company. And I think most reputable streamers will do that. And the ones that are not reputable, nobody's going to hire them anyway. So that just has resolved itself. You find you have different tiers, and Evan knows this too because he's worked with influencers for such a long time. Yeah, you have the paid ones. Those are the ones that your marketing and PR people deal with, and they are normally paid. As community, we'll help to promote them. We'll go into their channels. We'll talk to the players in the channels. But you can never overlook the really small streamers. The dude who might only have like 200 followers. That kind of falls to community to handle. And they don't need money. They need the one form of currency that is irreplaceable and more valuable than cash, and that is time. Your time to help support their efforts, and more importantly, developer time. If they can get a dev on the channel, even for 15 minutes to say a few words, that investment of time is the most valuable currency. So I think it's always smart to support your smaller streamers. I will say that in any company, you're going to have streamers that are going to have negative opinions about your game, or perhaps they hate your publisher, or they've got some axe to grind. You'll find that those people just naturally get less support, because why would we? If people have that mentality, they're going to find that they're going to have to create all of their own content without any help from anyone, because nobody wants to help somebody who's just yelling at you about whatever you're doing all the time. Like, oh, what the hell's that shirt you're wearing? That's terrible. What is this piece of junk car you're driving? What a wreck. This, like, no, you're not going to be able to convert that guy. They're either going to do it themselves or just let them go off and do their own thing.
Okay. Then I do want to move to another thing, because we've discussed how obviously communicating with streamers, working with streamers as from a CM capacity, total no-brainer. You want to work with the streamers, they carry these audiences. Stephen, I think you'll remember this because I asked this to you last year when we did our podcast. When I was young and I played World of Warcraft, I was enamored by the idea of a game master. The idea that someone could swoop in with these ungodly abilities that, like, you play this game. I played World of Warcraft the whole time. Then he comes in and he spawns an inferno and he becomes enormous. And I just remember, wow, that's like that. It was this like mysticism. And Stephen rightly said, they were game masters, but they were also in a way customer service specialists. And kind of what you see over time is that this discipline, first kind of the GM started kind of fading out, and then a lot of it has been automated. And to me, I always debate whether that was such a no-brainer to kind of move away from the GMs, because there is that idea of kind of you are building a community with these like player-facing people that kind of come in and kind of they help solve your problems, or they're just kind of goofing off for like a holiday event. I mean, I'll say Old School RuneScape does an amazing job with that, where every holiday event, all the JMods are going in and they're kind of being this huge. It's just an amazing thing to see when everyone's rallying around and following each other. So I guess my question to the roundtable here is, what happened to the GMs?
I think you hit the nail on the head when you mentioned holiday events. Like that's kind of where they
It's
went,
money.
right? Like,
It's money. It's purely
yeah,
money.
it's purely
Even
money,
at
purely
minimum wage,
financial.
the cost of keeping a GM on full time to play on servers and to be there personally, it's I mean, we're now in an age of AI. I think that both Evan and Stephen will agree that very often it's customer support and community management are the first areas of a dev team to be cut, almost always, and we certainly feel that the GMs were the first to go. I regret it too. I was part of a volunteer guide program. They were basically GMs, and that was great too. But there are some distinct disadvantages to using a volunteer system as well. It can be quite risky. But yeah, I'm sad to see them go, but it's the almighty dollar.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's unfortunately not really much more than that. I mean, game masters in a way evolved just out of that need in some early games that the only way that they could actually do things to sort of resolve customer service issues was actually to be in game. So like, hey, I have to physically, I have to pass items to your character or whatever it is that you couldn't do that behind the scenes. Um, and really, that was a very ineffective way of doing it for obvious reasons, right? And then those characters would sometimes, sometimes they might go off the reservation a bit, but more regular, or more, yeah, more regularly, it would be at those kind of sanctioned events, like a winter's event or whatever it is, a holiday of some kind. And those are fun because it's like, okay, everybody gets to learn off a bit of steam for a while, but that's really just a fun thing that happens a couple of times a year. Um, I don't financially, it just would not be possible to have live service with live GMs at the numbers you would need to have to make it feel that that was part of the experience, right? For any seriously large game, it just wouldn't be possible. AI might make it a bit more possible, but the truth is that there's been loads and loads of games which have tried to replicate that kind of anything can happen, moment to moment feel, and some have done it okay, and some have done it less okay. I mean, there's lots and lots of different MMO innovations, or from things like sharded dungeons or instance dungeons, all the way up to random AI-based events or whatever that have tried to get that in there. But it is, yeah, just really money versus the limitations of the systems that you're working with. But I do get why people kind of say, like, it's not even unusual for community members to literally list some of their best experiences of all time as being, oh, that time when this happened or this broke. Like, a classic example, I mean, a real classic example is the death of Lord British, right? When Richard Garriott went into, was it Ultima Online, or was it was definitely one of the Ultimas, and he forgot to make his character immune or indestructible or whatever, some command that he had to issue, and then I don't know whether it was one player or multiple, but he was killed, right? And it's literally cited in probably in academic papers these days as a classic example of an emergent gameplay, right? But that was just a mistake, it wasn't supposed to happen. It just happened accidentally, you know.
The both of you have reminded me of so many fun instances of whether it was emergent gameplay or whether it was someone going a little bit off script and that being unique because it was so real and human, and that Stephen, the anything it could happen ism, if you will, of that human touch, the fact that it wasn't an NPC, that there's actually a mechanical Turk operating the NPC basically. And I'm just reminded of, whether it was early Guild Wars 1 during the alphas and betas where they would hold town halls during the last hours of the test, and it was developers who were talking to you and taking questions, and there was this great just communal sense. Whether it was early vanilla and me and friends in my guild trying to break into parts of Hydral that we weren't supposed to get into just to see the little under construction sign, and knowing that it risked that we were going to be deported to GM Island briefly and then drop back in the world or some stuff and get a skull. Like there was a great sense of that. Sadly, and again, it's already been said, but the scalability, the scope just made it such that it couldn't touch all players all the time. And while it did create these great, almost legend or myth, these myths of these things happening, we haven't yet found a way to make it to have that same level of who knows what could happen, while at the same time making it make financial sense. Now, and I kind of hate that as a player of games, as a designer of games, as a community manager. I would love for us to find a way to make it so we can get back to that, while at the same time, and again, it's already been said, still making sure it isn't going to, create an incident or create, a situation where players are just seeking out the emergent gameplay as opposed to the core gameplay. But I feel like there has to be a way, there should be a way that we can find how to leverage the tooling that we have and still create that human touch element, even if it is just at holiday events or something like that, where it has the sort of the asterisk on it of, oh, this is unscripted. That means this is, in the raw and in the moment, and I'm eager to see how this turns out. It creates sort of the live concert effect, if you will, of, or the live theater effect, take your pick. But there's something really valuable there, and I feel it could be tapped into again.
Stephen, you remember like when we did our podcast, I was on this a lot, like the idea of creating unpredictability within these kind of MMOs that are very kind of, it's all very static, made on purpose because it's supposed to give like a baseline experience that doesn't kind of change too much because you logged on a Tuesday instead of a Thursday. But at the same time, the biggest moments of magic, and Evan, you said this, the idea of myth, and like when I grew up, all these stories of crazy things happening and hacks and kind of jumping over the hills of Don Moreau to get to the Gnome airship field, where like I'd always see that and I'd be flying over thinking, how do you get there? And then it's all this stuff that as MMOs get better and game studios can like deliver like in a lot of ways like really great solid updates, you miss that unpredictability, that kind of edge that then paradoxically creates all this content and all this rumoring and all this chatter, which makes the game feel more alive.
In a funny way, though, you're talking almost exclusively about areas where things either went wrong or they were exploitable for something to happen that was outside of the realm of the game, right? Because everybody knows, you're playing inside a system and the system has rules, and you can do some things and you can't do other things. I mean, the sort of the paradox of MMOs is that the massively part of it or massively multiplayer part of it is often not on display, right? Like some people are very much into that, right? There are certain MMOs that pride themselves on these massive events, with I think you probably, Evan and Linda probably played on some of these they tend to come from Asia, these like large Korean MMOs, we have massive boss battles, sieges, and that kind of stuff, right? But other people just play them because they like the idea of there being a living world, but they still want to play it mostly by themselves or just with some friends, right? So the difficulty is you have to potentially accommodate both ends of that spectrum, which is a gigantic feat in game design. But for me, I would say that without the exploits or the weird like GM triggered events and stuff, there's always a certain frisson when you get into game and there's a lot of people around, right? So you mentioned that sort of Guild Wars 1, and we did very similar things when I was doing City of Heroes in Europe, because we were like a year-ish behind the US. So we had our closed beta long after the game was live on the US servers, but we got to go through that period of time where it was like, okay, we're closing the game down for the beta ending, and then at the time we were wiping everybody's character progress and stuff. So everybody would be together in the same area, and there would be that feeling of like, oh, these are actually real people, right? Like these are other players that I can see and interact with, which is a very different experience, obviously, than pretty much anything else, right? Like, it's one of the main reasons to play. And that I think is something that a lot of people remember because it's unique, right? Like you will not get that happening again, because in the same reason that one night, that concert experience, as you mentioned, doesn't happen exactly the same way again, because the audience is going to change. The singer is in a different mood or whatever. So it's a unique experience for you to have that one time. And obviously, if on top of that, the GM spawns some giant monster and everybody has to fight it or whatever, right? Although the funny thing is, I don't know about Evan's experience, but 9 times out of 10, even in those scenarios, you can be like, I'm going to spawn the biggest monster in the game, and there's so many players in that area that it takes 10 seconds for them to destroy it anyway. But yeah, it's fun, it's memorable, but you really, I think the sense of camaraderie and the idea of like, I'm experiencing something that I will not get to experience again is what I think a lot of people take away. It's obviously different than, four of us finishing a single player game, right? We're all going to have the exact same experience, probably. It's all going to end in the same way. We're all going to see the same set of credits. And that, I think, has often been the secret sauce for MMOs, right? It's that emergent gameplay, but an emergent social experience, which I think is core to why they continue to thrive, really.
Linda, wasn't it ArcAge that we, at the end of alpha or beta, started spawning in endgame bosses into town? And it, again, that's like an edge case. It's like,
Classic.
only if you're in the beta and you're only like, and none of it matters and it's not intended gameplay, but it's still so much fun. It was such a great way to kind of like shoot off the fireworks at the end of the test.
Now, I've also been in a number of in-game events where we have literally crashed zones or on occasion the entire server. So there is that side of it. You can sometimes get mobbed with so many people that it becomes less fun. Earlier, I alluded to the almighty dollar, right? So let us also keep in mind that the price of a game, the purchase price of a game, has not gone up a lot since 1998, 1999, that sort of thing. We're still looking at roughly $69 is still the average for a game, right? Expenses for everything else have gone up tremendously. For those MMOs with subscription fees, those also have not gone up. How many MMOs do you know that are more than $15.99 a month? None. So there's less for companies to work with as well. And of course, managing these events, it's a lot of work. I miss it. I love it a whole lot. I don't know how realistic it is. I really don't want to open the AI box again, but there is potential that AI could do some interesting random stuff. We've seen parts of it. Evan and I both worked on Rift, and they had like random zone spawns built into the game design, which would show up, and the more people were in the zone, the bigger they were, and that sort of thing. So there, and that was years and years ago. So there's potential for there to be content created, but it isn't going to have the personal touch, like Stephen said. You aren't going to be able to log in and chase Brass around and take her down with your mighty sword of vengeance, that sort of thing. But keep an eye on this channel. Everything's evolving, right? And what was old is coming new again. We know people love the personal interactions, so who knows?
There's an activity that it's before my time at Bungie, but there was an activity that used to be held pretty regularly called the Bungie Bounty. And it was developers running, I'm not going to say tunes, running characters, running guardians. And basically it was very much get the dev. And it was, these great little moments of, there's not just a human, there's a human who actually is like on the dev team and there's meaning behind it. And I think that there is something very different when it is a scripted activity, even if we can make the scripted activity feel somewhat more organic or somewhat more human. There's something very different when it's actually like, I found a developer in the developer's game. That's really neat. And whether it's for a Q&A or whether it's to PvP them to death, it's still this great emergent thing. Stephen, I do want to touch on one more thing, and then I know probably Alessandro wants to move us on to the next, but the persona that you get from the unintendeds, the this is brokens, the hey, you guys are out of bounds, those are compelling and they make for, of course, great shareable content. I think there are also elements in terms of MMOs, specifically with a focus on massively multiplayer, in whether it's the opening of a new realm or the opening of a new server. I'm going to, again, harken back to ArcAge. When we would open a new server when we first launched, there was a land rush because
the land rush.
Yep, exactly. And you had these, it was basically persistent housing where you actually bought a plot and you built on the plot, and it was limited plots, and there were more desirable areas, places with like, a waterfall view, which I would always run to in the start of our server. And basically there was this great moment where we would see from streamers and also just from our in-game monitoring of thing, when we would open up and you just had this running of just a field of characters, crashing servers every now and then, sure, but like just characters running and trying to get the resources, and you see them building their houses right away. There was this great moment of just, whether it's emergent, whether it's part of the core loop, it really is more core loop, but it was this sense of, oh, there are lots of people doing this thing and I'm part of it. And I think that's a really unique emotion to try to achieve more regularly in online games.
Yeah.
So, please, Stephen, please add to it.
No, I was just saying, I think that's very fair. Yeah, it is something I think that is unique to the genre, or yeah, no, the genre is fair. And I think a lot of devs do aspire to it, but it's not technically easy either. So, that's definitely part of the equation as well, right? Like even that idea of like persistent housing, that's not an easy thing to do. The fact that you can crash servers because of player demand, means that's what most live operations teams do not want to do. They don't want the servers to fall over. But it's exciting. Yeah, for sure. It's definitely exciting.
Just launch was challenging.
Was it rough?
A lot happened. It was good though.
Yeah.
I mean, what happens then when rather than internally, it's the community management team or the development team that creates these events? What I've been noticing is that a lot of gaming is shifting towards players kind of creating their own servers, creating their own type of gameplay, and ultimately creating their own kinds of events. And so I'll give you guys like a scenario. One of the coolest things I think that has happened to World of Warcraft is that all the streamers got together. Kind of the main one is the streamer called SWTOR, and he created this kind of game mode or event called Only Fangs with a G, right? So just like the fangs of a snake. And the interesting thing is that they leveraged the hardcore kind of game mode in World of Warcraft, which was, by the way, created by an add-on, which was made by a community of kind of plugin developers. And they created this kind of Hogwarts style, like team-based, we need to make it to level 60 to then do the Molten Core raid. And you have like two different teams of people kind of going against each other. And you have like all these streamers basically inviting other streamers to play, some who are like pro World of Warcraft players, others who are completely new to the game. And kind of when I was watching it and thinking about it, I thought, is this like the next paradigm shift for these online worlds? Is that kind of streamers come in, they create their own events, which then gets broadcasted through all these other streamers, that then it goes all over Twitch. And it becomes like this like MMORPG meets live television or reality television. And just these unscripted moments. And I find that so fascinating because it's incredibly entertaining, and the outreach you get from all these streamers all kind of broadcasting stuff together, and kind of, especially in hardcore, if someone dies, they lose their entire character, so it's dramatic. It just created this like must-see TV moment, which I thought was brilliant. And again, it was completely kind of grassroots from the community.
Not every game can do it, because of limitations in terms of the gameplay and stuff. But I mean, it's always exciting when communities, pull that kind of stuff together. And obviously these days, with what you're talking about, the sort of the leverage power really of a large name on a Twitch or something similar. I mean, they're obviously serving themselves too, right? They're trying to make something that is compelling to watch, and then they're enlisting other streamers to come along with them to kind of, have a multiplier effect on that. Obviously, from a community point of view, it's great if you happen to be the subject of that. There have been a few games that have tried to do it. There's been a few games that have tried to do things like, oh, if you're watching Twitch, you'll be able to vote on the outcome, or you'll be able to, drop stuff into the fight at certain points and things like that. And to my knowledge, none of them have been super successful, right? It's kind of nice to think that maybe that is the future of the, that kind of entertainment space, but so far it doesn't seem to have worked. But I think that's probably because, I mean, the vast majority of people playing are not playing on stream, right? They're not playing in front of an audience. In a strange way, you'd almost have to say that the way that would happen and become potentially large enough to become sort of, an entertainment brand in itself, you'd have to limit the playing to the people who are streaming, right? Which no one's going to do because, financially, again, it's like, a disaster, right? In a weird way, what I keep thinking about is that we're sort of describing something like, I don't know, the Hunger Games, right? Or the Running Man. You're describing this kind of live broadcast entertainment which focuses around some sort of game or competition that has very, very high stakes, right? The only difference here is we're talking about something that's virtual, you know. So I think it's cool that they do it, but I don't think there's going to be many. There may be attempts, certainly by companies, by community teams who are enterprising, to replicate that kind of thing. And I think you see it more and more in games like Fortnite, in games like Roblox as well, right, where people can make their own game modes and do their own specific kind of stuff. I've seen streamers who have played matches where they're doing a custom level that they built, and then they invite people on to play it, and there's kind of a whole thing that's happening there. That's really interesting. But that is just, I think, a question of using the platform that they're given in a specific way, which is an interesting development. Interestingly enough, though, again, Fortnite didn't start off like that. Like, that isn't what they did when they built Fortnite. I'm not 100% sure about Roblox, but I don't think Roblox was 100% about player-built stuff when it launched. But I could be wrong on that one, to be fair.
I believe it, just in a different capacity for sure. Yeah,
okay.
Definitely not in its modern iteration. I don't believe.
Yeah, but now the numbers on people kind of ignore Roblox in the industry, which is a mistake, because the numbers on it are bananas. they dwarf everything else. They're so big that they're almost incomprehensible. They're just gigantic. And in a weird way, they share some DNA with things like RuneScape, right? Because Roblox can run on a potato of a computer on any laptop, pretty much. So as a result, it just gets those higher numbers, and on mobile and on console. Yeah.
Linda, did you want to chime in, or?
Not really. They covered pretty much anything that I would say on that topic. Yeah,
I mean, I would add quickly, just as an example of a game I found very fascinating. It's GTA Roleplay. Because kind of what the roleplay servers have done, oh my goodness, like the amount of stuff that they've been able to build over GTA 5, like running tube systems, this idea that you can be a medic, you can be a cop, that people are live broadcasting their voice, so it's almost like you're actually role playing, like you're talking and you're being a comedian. And it's like, I'm not being myself right now. I'm being this kind of junkie running the streets, like trying to run away from the cops and then getting upset. Like, it's that kind of emergent gameplay is like, I'm speaking personally here, while we're going a little bit off topic, but in general, when I look at like community building, like I wonder if it's going to be one massive community, like it was like when I grew up, like playing World of Warcraft, like you had like this one big server, like a couple really big servers, or if they're just going to be pockets of communities run by players. And then the first one to kind of get something right, to build some kind of entertaining game mode or some kind of content, is the one that flares up and then spins off into new genres, kind of like Ice Frog created Dota, and now we have League of Legends and everything, right?
Exactly that.
Yeah, and I mean, Player Unknown, we mentioned earlier the whole Fortnite Player Unknown Battleground connection. I mean, there are Fortnite Islands now. There's lots and lots of ways for people to build out potentially interesting modes that can then spin up into something else. The interesting thing about GTA Online is it's a convergence of multiple factors that make it possible, right? Like Twitch, obviously, live streaming. But it's also the infrastructure and the world that they built out with online. Like, I don't know when GTA Online started, but it certainly obviously didn't start when the online portion of the game started. It came in later. And then also you need people who are interested and committed enough to do that. So it's the ability to spin up private servers, or at least, invite-only servers, and then sort of get people to commit to, doing the thing that they're all agreeing to. It's kind of weird to hear the phrase, because like MMOs had RP servers back in the day, right? Like, where it was like you sort of the tacit agreement that you're going to come on and attempt to role play as much as possible, whether it's in chat or in interpersonal reactions. Funnily enough,
but yes.
Right, yeah. But funnily enough, they didn't really take it as far as a GTA Online, where you're getting people to come in and essentially literally act the part, right? Which is a step beyond, I think, what anyone really ever wanted to do in MMOs.
I think one quick add is we're talking about ways to plus up existing games, or ways to play existing games in unique ways. Honestly, I think if we take it even one step further back, we look to how DayZ being an Arma mod. Effectively, what we're talking about is modding, where they're taking existing platform, existing tooling, and making something fantastic with. You can go even further back, going to the Doom era, where you had level designers finding interesting ways to use this software platform, if you will, to tell even other stories. Now, granted, it was a little bit more limited back then, but the notion of games as an iterative art form is, part of our genetics, I think, as a business, as as a medium, even. And so I think that seeing players take that in new ways using the new tooling available to them, and to jump to the forward where we have Roblox facilitating this with their existing tooling, or even on a social level, it's not exactly modding. I know I'm kind of stretching it for the sake of this point here, but the notion of this kind of like be social modding, if you will, of, well, hey, GTA works in this fashion. It has this communication platform. I can tell interesting stories with it that are compelling, even if they aren't part of the core gameplay loop. Ergo, I am actually adding to it in a unique way. And to just kind of take this in full circle, much like IceFrog with Dota, you would then have essentially, at what point does it sort of mutate out into its own thing and become a new entity unto itself? And that sort of emergence is where we see new interesting genres come about.
Emergent gameplay is the best bastard child of AI, right? It's easier than ever for people to make games from scratch. This is a good thing, and it's only a matter of time before a proper sandbox, a real metaverse, is made where you can build worlds within worlds. It's coming, and I'm here for it. All right, on the topic of roleplay, the people that I have played games with for the last 27, 30 years are, very few of them are role players. And I don't give a rat's ass. I'll still waddle in there with my ale in one hand, my sword or my axe or whatever I'm wielding in the other hand, and you better look out. And it drives people crazy when I start talking in that accent in text, because it can be challenging to read. But, I don't care. And I find that people will respond to it on non-roleplay servers. It's infectious. You make the fun that you want. We had a guild on Star Wars Galaxies where our entire guild was all roleplay. And we had this huge city on the toughest planet out there, and it was absolutely glorious. So, I mean, there is a mood out there for this sort of thing. In MMOs, though, pure roleplay servers and pure PvP servers can struggle a little bit. Roleplay usually has an easier time of it because, PvP is usually dominated by, let's say, those of slightly less social values in life. How do you guys? Are you guys running PvP games at the moment?
So, Bungie, we just launched Marathon, which is highly PvP. And of course, Destiny has a ton of PvP content as well. In fact, we just ended an event called Iron Banner, which is all about PvP. So, short answer, yes.
And here I am. See, I'm jumping all over Genghis's live stream here, but I think one thing that is interesting to discuss is the fundamental differences between a PvP community, at which everything is at risk and everything's super high drama all the time, and a roleplay community, or just a standard community. So, Stephen, what are your opinions on that? I'm sure you've worked with both.
I mean, I'm not a PvP guy. And part of the reason is because, as silly as it may sound, I want to keep my virtual goodies, right? And so if I'm not going to voluntarily play a game where it's like, okay, you go in and if you die, you lose everything, or people can steal your stuff or whatever. That's just not me. I have respect for people who do, and I have a lot of respect for games that kind of take it to the nth degree. EVE Online kind of being a classic example of that, right? Where they claim that essentially the universe is player driven, and a number of other games have tried to do the same thing. But that's a very tall order, and you have to bear in mind the fact that there's going to be some real, or rather, I should say, virtual mirroring of some of the worst crimes you can imagine in real life, right? I mean, no one's actually physically getting hurt, right? But if you go in and can somehow essentially destroy maybe thousands of hours of somebody's game time experience that's been accumulated, that's going to suck for the other player. And you can certainly argue that, hey, they knew what they were signing up for, right? But it's a very different thing than a marathon or any kind of online shooter, where really all you're probably going to do is like, okay, I lose a match, I win a match. You might be trying to get your ranking up or your ELO or whatever, but that's a little different than when you're putting your fleet on the line in EVE Online, right? And that's why that game has made for some truly epic stories of, player community and player actions, because they can also form up in these massive corporations, right? It's obviously different tastes for different people, but the one thing I will say is about running a community in that kind of PvP environment is interesting, because now you mentioned at the very beginning, like it's governance, it's not necessarily community management. I think it's a lot more like governance in that scenario, because at that point, the developers, in a way, are literally the government, but they're more than that. They're actually like the laws of the universe, right? Because they get to decide how everything works, right? So, then you better be damn sure when you make some change to how, I don't know, the calculations work for damage being done, that is going to potentially upend everything in the game, not just like, piss off a few people who are upset now that their paladin doesn't do as much damage, right? It's like, no, you just changed the entire way the game plays, and affected so much stuff as a result, right? So, yeah, that's a tough thing to do.
I think,
yeah.
Just for some quick context on that, Marathon actually is a full loot PvP game, so it is actually got a lot of that lossiness. It is definitely a different community, not even community type, forgive me. It's actually more just different games do have different levels of that sense of severity and urgency when it comes to how it approaches PvP. And there is some self-select, but at the same time, especially since you're referencing, classic EVE Online stories, how many times did we feed over, links to team members about like, oh yeah, just casually about $300,000 worth of Plex got lost because somebody got, gate potted by, interceptors, and they were trying to get it through nullsec the wrong way. So yeah, no, good times.
I do think we're converging around this idea of consequence, right? Like, I can look at so many titles where, like, let's say Pokemon, right? You think it's like a pretty like linear game. But even then, people have created, I think it's called Nuzlocke, and I've tried it because it's quite appealing. But like the idea that you only get the Pokemon that you have to catch the first one that you see, and then you can only catch one from each area, and then if they die forever, right? So you can't just go back to, and so it's this whole kind of strategic way where you're kind of picking the Pokemons you get, and there's so much more to it. But like, I find it fascinating how, like, once you play a game a lot, at some point, like, you need this edge, you need this idea of loss, especially for online communities where, like, things are now on the line. I think EVE, like you guys brought up really well, like these huge battles between corporations, like there needs to be something that happens. I think same thing for hardcore. I've spoken to a lot of people about hardcore, like in World of Warcraft, and they thought, like, it just made vanilla WoW feel real again, because now I want to, like, I'm actually have to approach the game in a completely different way. So, that's what I find fascinating about games, is that as things become so kind of repetitive, at some point we can, and it's often the community doing this, they self-impose difficulties to then kind of give the whole game a new life. And I don't know if you guys have thoughts on that, but I just find that so interesting, because the top 10 games, have been around for the last 10, 15 years? Like, if you look at, like, in the rankings of, like, the ones that are still kind of in the top. So is it almost inevitable that games just have to get so difficult?
That games have to get so difficult in terms of
that you have to create this level of consequence, like that there's a level of loss, right? Like, to get people to keep coming back, you have to almost impose it. I don't even think there's much of a question here, guys. It's more, I'm just fascinated with the whole idea of it.
I think it's more setting a new. Sorry, Linda, if you want to dive in real fast.
I'm so sorry. I have to bail. I have a tremendous amount of very urgent things that I have to take care of now. I could sit here for another 4 hours talking to the three of you. This has been a brilliant conversation, and I would love to do this again on not beta launch day. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you all. Have a great chat. Talk about me all you like. Bye. And yes, if I die, you can have my stuff.
Yay. Let's see. To answer your question, I think it's maybe not so much a matter of that it has to become increasingly the consequence has to be higher. I think you do have to keep on adding new activities, new content, new challenges for players to feel a sense of wanting to test the metal, test their metal, test their what they've whether it's collected in the game or skills that they've earned in the game or ability against an even greater challenge. I think that is part of the nature of. I mean, you start getting into the talk about power creep and about scope and things like that. But as games grow, there needs to be not so much even like necessarily more to do, but there has to be some new horizon for players to pursue.
There has to be a reason to come back. There's always got to be a reason to come back. And you can certainly make the argument that sometimes the community is the reason that you come back, right? I'm sure Evan said the same thing. We've both heard the phrase like, oh, I only play for the community, or, I would have long ago left if it hadn't been for the community, right? But I think what you're actually getting at is a key problem with MMOs in general, which is that you ultimately do have to design for the end game. And the earlier you start thinking about that, the better it generally is, because there's two ways to, well, there's thousands of ways to approach it, but there's broadly often two ways to approach it. One is just endless content, right? But that has the highest cost, the most difficult path in terms of production cost, and the constant development cycle. And the other is to try and figure out how you can make the game essentially run itself, which generally speaking is going to become PvP, although there have been some exceptions where it's like, okay, we can create systems so that players can build out, stuff themselves forever, right? Minecraft isn't traditional in the sense of it doesn't have really a leveling curve, but Minecraft is an infinite game because you can do anything you want, right? Like, and players can choose to do what they want. They can do, build stuff, explore. It's also procedural, which helps. But it's very, very difficult for MMOs. And I've been on projects where there wasn't necessarily a lot of thought given to what was going to happen at the end game. And then you quickly discover that you've got a situation where players get to the end and they are, by definition, your most dedicated players. They're the most excited about getting to the end. But then they get there and they go, well, there's nothing to do, right? So ultimately they leave, right? Because, they need to have something, right? So the trick is like, okay, what can we do? And generally speaking, it's either going to be endlessly repeatable PvE, type activities, whether it's, dungeons or raiding or usually some sort of, loot grind, for lack of a better term, or it's PvP based. But the problem being that not everybody likes PvP, right? So in a game like Eve, while there is a certain amount of things you can do without involving yourself in PvP with other players, that's really the ultimate goal of that game, right? You are going to come into some sort of conflict, whether it's economic or literal, with other players. But in something like WoW, the difficulty there has always been like, okay, what do you do at endgame? And it's like, okay, dungeons and and raids and stuff. But they would probably argue that PvP should be the ultimate goal. But they have such a massive base of PvE players that they also have to continue to just put out expansions, which is not that difficult in the sense that they're one of the biggest games in the world, were, and they can therefore get that money to pay those developers to continue to expand it. But there's also the difficulty of just continuing to come up with new ideas for stuff, over and over and over again. It's a difficult thing to do, as any design team will tell you.
If you guys had to recommend any advice to someone who wants to break into community management, because I think a big reason why this show started is just to expose the different disciplines in game development and then kind of show the paths into how people broke into it. And we didn't get to talk enough about kind of your journeys into the craft itself. But for someone listening right now, what advice would you give? They want to break into games. They maybe want to break into a CM path. How would they do it? What would you recommend?
Stephen, I'm sure that you've heard, and I know I've heard a lot, the glib, knee-jerk response of "don't."
It was literally the first thing that came into my head.
I've heard it lots of times too. To be fair, at this point,
I try to push back against it. I mean, yeah, it's fun for for an icebreaker to respond that way, but I've been trying to respond more considerably when asked, This is all to say, there's a number of different communities out there of folks who either are looking for their second position in games or their first position in games. And I've gotten a couple of pings from folks saying like, hey, Evan, I really enjoyed the little bit of community management that I was either privy to or handled, tangentially in my last role. I really am thinking about pivoting, or, hey, I just finished my degree, or I'm finishing my degree in communications, and I really feel like there's an opportunity to pair a great love of mine, video games, with a skill that I've, really started to put time and effort and education into. And it can be really challenging to explain how community roles are sometimes they're a little like hen's teeth. They're a little rare. They do not tend to be open terribly often, especially more entry-level positions. There are roles that are kind of more tangential into it in terms of whether you go more the social media route, more early influencer manager route. Marketing internships are pretty decent for getting that exposure. I think beyond that, there are other ways to build the expertise to get a leg up on the competition. A lot of folks have a lot of folks have identified that Discord servers effectively are small communities, and they do require community management and community managers to monitor, to grow, to foster. There are any number of these servers out there which you can essentially become part of, especially within a space that you already have a vested interest or a fandom for. And essentially, while it isn't paid work usually, it is still highly relevant, especially when so many studios are going to be looking for Discord right there at the top of the resume as one of the platforms and skill sets. To be blunt, as somebody who, again, is a slightly more aged community manager at almost 20 years of doing this, Discord was a platform that I had to really study and learn. And I saw, it's the growth and the potential, but it's one more platform on top of all the other platforms that we're learning. The reason I highlight this is for folks who are already just natively participating in Discord servers, probably already have more just base knowledge on how to operate them, the ins and outs, the tooling, the software, the et cetera, the pitfalls to avoid, compared to, frankly, a lot of senior and director level community managers do. There is value there to be had, especially if you're bringing that to the fore and bringing that to the toolbox that a greater community bench can leverage. So essentially, long and short is identify ways to grow the skills, even if they aren't at necessarily, even indie level studios, because as long as you are collecting groups of folks under a single banner for a single purpose and using your skills to grow them and foster them and to create a constructive and healthy community, that is gold on a resume, even for a paid early entry position.
Yeah, couldn't say it much better myself. I mean, I think it ultimately just boils down to find a community that you're interested in, get involved in it somehow, or make it yourself, of course. And you'll self-teach the skills, right? Like, the stuff that we kind of started talking about very early on, which is like the soft skills, those personal kind of attributes you obviously can't really teach, but I think you'll probably know before you even try and do this, if that's your thing. You know what I mean? If you can't stand the way that people talk on the internet, if you can't handle the way that people get upset about stuff in a Discord or whatever, then you're not really going to have the temperament to do it as a job. But I don't think many people identify this as a job without having that, in place. I mean, I think there was maybe a time, when CMs were kind of seen as like, that cool public face of the company, and people would say to me like, "Oh, the job looks amazing," and you're like, "Yeah," because you see some public aspect of it that doesn't cover all the other stuff. But that's the same with any job, really. But yeah, I think the baseline is the same, which is like, you're going to have to sort of self-learn the skills to a certain degree, but the tools are right there. Whether it's Discord or whether it's becoming a Reddit moderator or whatever. And social media is definitely a potential way in as well, although that tends to be a bit more focused on the content side of things. But that's a valid, sort of adjacent and often blended, kind of career choice as well. I mean, I think the main thing to do is, yeah, do that, and also just try and keep abreast of as much of the stuff as possible, and yeah, if you want to do it, you'll do it. I mean, I think it's hard to quantify how many people started as fans and then ultimately became professionals. It's pretty much the story for almost everybody, I think, really.
So dang true.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've certainly hired many people who were straight up fan site owners or whatever it happened to be, and seen them succeed in community roles.
Speaking, I mean, if Linda were here, she would explain how she too was also, early Everquest and part of the guide program there. From my own experience, I ran fan sites for Hellgate London before they said, "Hey, come over to San Francisco and do it for real." I have hired people from the community before, much like yourself. Absolutely, it kind of goes back, actually, and I'm reminded of a GDC panel. I don't know if you and I were on it together, Stephen. We might have been, but better yet, any panel that you've been on, how many times is one of the first folks who come up to the mic saying, "How do I get in? What do I do first?" And the best answer that I can give them, you were asking specifically about community management, which is a little bit more unique in terms of where to actually start, considering there aren't really classes for it per se. Doesn't matter. One of the first things I would tell people, and they come up and say, "I'm a level designer. I want to be a level designer." I'm like, great. Make something with that passion. Make a demo level. Make 10 demo levels. Make levels that influence other levels in a unique way where they're not supposed to. Do something with that energy. Put it into a portfolio. Make it part of your pitch. More than that, you're going to learn so many things by even doing that exercise. You'll then learn, okay, maybe I don't want to do level design. Maybe I want to be a texture artist. Maybe I want to do, AI pathing. Maybe I want to, whatever it is. And it was interesting to see the reaction of, wait, I can just start? I can just do stuff? And I don't mean to belittle the response, but it was just it was interesting to see the watershed moment where they appreciated that they didn't need to wait for the go ahead. They didn't need to first get their foot in and then start. That they're really, especially now, and the panels I'm referring to are, years and years ago where, software was more expensive, platforms were more inaccessible, etc. Now they're not. There's even the barrier to entry to start doing cool things with your innovation and your drive is thinner than ever. And I think that's fantastic. Again, to touch on the thing we talked about earlier, how we're going to see not just more emergent gameplay out of that, but we're going to see more emergent talent come out of that, who before would have been a monetary barrier or a time barrier or, a perception of the difficulty involved, whatever it was. So whether you want to be a level designer, a data scientist, or a community manager, as long as you're doing something interesting with that drive and building a portfolio out of it, you will then have something that you can leverage moving forward and actually do something great with. I really do think.
Just go build something, create something. Gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for coming on to this roundtable. Unfortunately, couldn't say bye to Linda because she had to shoot off, but that's also on me. She had a crazy day and she jumped on despite of everything going on. So I just want to thank you both. It's been a brilliant conversation. I really enjoyed hearing your perspectives.